how to change that. Nosotros vemos que los canales brasileños y todo eso, entonces es como que esto tiene mucho peso, y entonces los chiquilines como que, yo qué sé, lo adaptan, y es lo que hablan, a veces más que el español, y lo ves. Y yo creo que es una de las cosas que se pierde en la frontera, la identidad, porque ellos terminan hablando cualquier cosa, porque es cualquier cosa el portuñol. Entonces pierden lo del español y lo del portugués. Basically not recognizing speaking both as valid, or having a bilingual identity is being completely rejected. Now I have some positive comments. There are those as well, people who view this positively in the community. So one person said, hay un gran porcentaje en una cierta clase social en la que se permitió, ¿vistes? Ya viene de padres a hijos a que eso continuara. Y hoy en día continúa. And it doesn't reveal, it could have been said negatively, but the way that he says it, I might have to include the audio for this one, because you could read this negatively. And then for 15 it says, cuando uno se va para Montevideo, es visto como algo inferior, ¿no? Incluso uno se cuida mucho de no hablar nada entreverado, porque si no, dicen, le llaman a uno de bachano. Pero acá no, acá es muy natural. Bachano is a very derogative term, and if you use your imagination, you'll think of similar terms that people use here for language mixing. So attitudes toward language mixing, again, some are negative, some are positive. Starting with the negative, this individual says, entra el brasilero y eso no es bueno. So you're speaking Spanish and you use Portuguese, that's not good. En 17, como es frontera y se mezclan los idiomas, como que no se habla bien ni el de allá ni el de acá. So again, very negative, not well spoken. They don't know Spanish, they don't know Portuguese, they know neither. Therefore, they resort to this portuñol that nobody respects really, or some people do. And then the positive comments with respect to language mixing. And 18, los que salen de Montevideo, nada. ¿Qué es lo que dice? ¿Qué dice? No, ¿qué hay por aquel? Piensan que lo están insultando y no es así. Está hablando normal, la cosa es que normal, es normal. And then in 19, se puede concebir que el cambio como una riqueza comunicativa, un bilingüismo informal. There are the positive comments regarding language mixing. So I wanted to have a target of about 50 tokens per speaker of the 54. I did not get that many for every speaker. There are speakers like the one you saw that just said Portugués en la escuela. He didn't even get to it. I had to really, it was not a good interview. It really was not. Other people will talk your ear off. Those were easy. But sometimes in the group interviews, this was particularly the reason why I didn't get to 50 for a lot of participants, because there was someone dominating the conversation. It might have been the first person I met. It might have been someone that was older. Whatever the dynamic was between the usually in a group of three, but it could have been husband and wife too. I had those where one or the other would dominate, and you know, you can't say, oh, I want to listen to this person too. You know, you just kind of have to go with it. You're trying to get the most natural language you can. So there are fewer tokens for also intervocal G due to its lesser frequency of occurrence in Spanish. It's much less frequently than B or B. And so I have a total of 7,009 tokens. I used R rule, which is a statistical program in R. It determines relevant probabilities and correlations between dependent and independent variables. And so I use this obviously to determine what the correlations are between Spanish variants and Portuguese variants, and my social variables, which are language use preference and the two types of attitudes. So in table 2, you can see that these Portuguese variants are only reaching 15.2% in the community-wide. So it's not something that you would hear immediately upon arriving. One of the most curious, and I've been doing some other research with a colleague, is that a lot of the preposition de, you would expect it to be very weak, but it's actually very strong. So people say, todo de, something like that, which is not what you would expect. However, overall, these are not overwhelmingly frequent. The approximants dominate. I mean, this is a place where Spanish is the official language. There's lots of pressure to speak Spanish, and there's been social stigmatization of Portuguese, prohibition of Portuguese in local schools, very akin to what we've seen in the state with Spanish, very similar. And then deletion, so instead of saying lado, lao, instead of saying lobo, lo, instead of saying, which one am I forgetting? Cao, cao, right? No, I did that one. Instead of, so lago, lake, and lado, side, can sound the same, lao, right? Deleting. Not very common either. We would see very different distributions in other dialects of Spanish. So here, where we are, if we go down to the north of Mexico to Chihuahua, we would see almost exclusively the approximants. If we were to go to Cuba, we might see this deletion rising up to maybe 40 or 50%, maybe greater. So it's pretty restrained in this community. It's not viewed as positive either, but the fact is that it's Spanish. It's something typical of Spanish. So that is also a way that people sort of avoid associations with Portuguese. So you can see the Portuguese phones here are very much stacked against what we would consider to be Spanish. So of the four variables that I discussed, only one, attitudes toward language mixing, was found to be statistically insignificant. It is not significant. There are no significant interactions between the variables. I need to look at other variables perhaps and see if I can tease that out of it. And so the results from the multivariate analysis are shown in this table. I don't know if you can see that, but I'll do my best to explain everything. So those that use those that use Spanish less than 40% of the time, so they're using Portuguese majority of the time, it's predicted that they will use typically Portuguese variants. So stops like lado, lobo, lago, and then lavar, which is not a stop, but it's typical Portuguese. The intermediate group that sort of uses both languages, on a day-to-day, there's not a strong use preference for either one. They're right in the middle. They're not really predicted to use Portuguese variants or not use them. They fall right in the middle. And then those who use Spanish over 80% of the time, this is all self-reported. Not the most reliable way, but one of the only ways to do this. It has a probability or a factor weight of only 34, which means that it's disfavored. So speakers who don't use Portuguese much will not incorporate these sounds into their speech, in essence. We see a very similar trend with respect to language preference. Those that prefer Portuguese are predicted to use the articulations, realizations of these phones in Portuguese, and those that prefer Spanish will not. And then finally, attitudes toward border Portuguese or Portuñol. Those that have positive attitudes toward Portuñol are predicted to use Portuguese variants more than they would Spanish variants. And then if they have negative attitudes, then we know that they'll most likely avoid these realizations, these variants. So we know that the greater use of Portuguese in Rivera impacts the use of typically Portuguese variants in border Uruguayan Spanish. And since this entire class they're called voice obstruents, badaga, and labiodental fricative are realized by Portuguese dominant speakers as they are in Portuguese, there's a clear effect of frequency of use on the use of Portuguese variants, despite historical attempts to quash Portuguese. So Portuguese is finding its influence and its way in the community, not just lexically. That's a different study I'm working on, where people say, instead of basura, they might say lixo. Voy a tirar algo en el lixo. Things like that. Like here you would hear somebody say, estamos en la troca, right? That would be a loan from English. So this influence is seeping in through the sounds of the language as well in Spanish. And moreover, a preference for Portuguese, which is more closely tied to issues of language identity since it involves choice, as we saw in earlier comments, this also results in the greater use of typically Portuguese variants. Positive attitudes toward Portuñol also condition the use of typically Portuguese variants. and the acceptance of local Portuguese is tied to community norms, and the use of badega and va in speech reflects this acceptance. Rejection of local norms through the greater use of approximants may not be motivated by assertions of non-border identities per se, since these could also be motivated by profession or gender, maybe age, maybe formal study, it could be education. These are things I'd have to look at for future studies. I don't know if I'm going to incorporate them into this study or not. I'll have to really work on that. And in conclusion, Portuguese dominant individuals demonstrate influence from this language in their Spanish. Their greater use of this language and consequently the sounds of this language within the community seem to be a way for bilinguals to align themselves more closely with Brazil, which is reflected in their attitudes toward Portuñol. Those who stigmatize Portuñol and reject it tend to follow monolingual Spanish norms as a way to align themselves with more nationalistic ideologies. Identity is obviously a complex issue that has many facets, language being only one of them, but the use of speech sounds, especially as they relate to specific languages in bilingual communities, is a strong marker of identity, and I think much more revealing than manner of dress, style, and the like. I think it really goes to who you are, and it's expression of who you are, something much more permanent, something maybe more akin to ethnicity or heritage. I think that they're that powerful. That's just my opinion. And this presentation shows that speech sounds are used in bilingual communities as a way to align with either local standards or national norms. We would tend to do the same thing here. And when one identifies, even as a native speaker of English, it's hard for me to say enchilada. I don't say it. I just don't say it. Or burrito. I can't do it. So when I say these words, that's another example of how you identify as a bilingual or as someone who speaks Spanish and loves Spanish and sees that in a positive way rather than rejecting it and saying, you know, just speak American and burrito and enchilada. Sorry for the accent, that was wrong. Anyway, thank you very much. So I don't know if anybody has any questions. It's not a whole lot of time, but yeah.
Somebody did a similar study with the bodega in Yucatec Spanish.
Okay.
And they found actually really
Is it
similar.
Mignovich?
Yes, yeah. He's wonderful.
Yes.
But and he found also the way more stops. But he did a comparison of bilingual and monolingual, which obviously would work for
yeah, I didn't
this.
do that. Yeah.
But I really, this was just more of a comment. Like I liked that kind of that tie to identity. I thought that was really neat because where you are, you can't. Or I mean, can you do a monolingual, bilingual? Yeah, it seems.
No,
like
I mean, the only way to do monolingual, you could do monolingual Portuguese, but like I said, monolingual Spanish, it's practically non-existent because even for speakers that don't speak Spanish often, you have understanding. You grow up around it. It's kind of like heritage speakers in New Mexico that understand everything. Or my wife is a heritage Portuguese speaker. Her dad was Brazilian. And so she understands everything. We're at family reunions, and she understands every single word that's said, but she's afraid. She has vergüenza. She has this fear of speaking the language. Mm-hmm. So that's the problem with the speech variable that I have. It doesn't get to understanding, which would be, I just don't have that. But yeah, I think it's very, would be very interesting to do that. I think if you were to do that, you'd have to get monolingual Portuguese from Santana on the other side of the border, and then you'd have to go more into the interior. But the further you get away, the more different the norms are for the way Spanish is spoken. So like you saw in the comments, if we were to go to Montevideo, they wouldn't do the same thing. You would be modeling a monolingual variety that is sort of unknown to people in the area. Yeah. And that'd be kind of tough.
I was going to say real quick, it's funny how you say you can't say burrito, but I can hear the Texan when you say I can't do it.
Yeah.
Just the way you say it. The way I can hear it. It. But it's interesting also that there's this thing with La Capital, right? Yeah. Like it happens in Mexico all the time. I mean, you go to DF and they say, tú no eres de aquí, ¿cómo se sabe? Aquí en el DF no tenemos acento.
Right.
That's what they tell you. The same thing as Montevideo, there's the difference between los de afuera or whatever, and
That's what they
la
call it.
capital.
Yeah, para afuera. That's what they say when they
So
go.
it's interesting.
Yeah, no, this happens all over. You know.
Yeah.
And usually it's coming from centers of power and influence historically. So yes, DF would be that in Mexico, and from the very, very beginnings of Mexico. And then Montevideo was actually established as a fortification against the Portuguese. So this back and forth has been happening for years. And the Portuguese were the first to settle this region, but then the border was drawn, right? Kind of like here, where you had Mexicanos living here, and then the border was, oh, now it's the United States. But Spanish keeps going, and their Portuguese keeps going. And the interesting thing is you see the influence in the other language, right? So you see that now influence from Spanish. You can see Spanish influence from the English that's spoken here too, which is not studied nearly enough. If anybody wants to do something like that, let me know. Any other questions? I think that's my time. Thank you very much.